Have you ever experienced a moment when you reacted in a way that surprised you? A sudden burst of anger, an unexpected feeling of jealousy, a thought that felt strange, uncomfortable, or even disturbing. And immediately after that moment, you might have thought to yourself, why did I react like that? That's not who I am. Carl Jung believed that moments like these reveal something extremely important about the human mind. According to Jung, every human being carries within them a hidden psychological dimension, a hidden part of the personality that contains everything we refuse to accept about ourselves. This hidden dimension of the psyche is what Jung called the shadow. The shadow is one of the central concepts of Jungian psychology, and understanding it helps us understand something very profound about human nature. Because according to Jung, the shadow is not something rare. It is not something that only exists in violent people or criminals. The shadow exists inside every human being. To understand how the shadow works, we first need to understand Carl Jung himself and the psychological framework he developed. Carl Gustav Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst who lived between 1875 and 1961. He is considered one of the most influential figures in the history of psychology. Early in his career, Jung worked very closely with Sigmund Freud. Freud saw Jung as the future of psychoanalysis. For several years, they collaborated and exchanged ideas. However, over time, their views about the human mind began to diverge. Freud believed that most psychological conflict originated from repressed sexual desires and early childhood experiences. Jung, on the other hand, believed the human psyche was much deeper and more symbolic than Freud had imagined. He believed the human mind was connected not only to personal experiences, but also to universal patterns of meaning. This is what led Jung to develop his theory of the collective unconscious. According to Jung, beneath our personal unconscious lies a deeper layer of the mind that is shared by all human beings. This collective layer contains universal symbolic patterns called archetypes. These archetypes appear in myths, religions, dreams, and stories across cultures. Examples of archetypes include figures like the hero, the mother, the wise old man, and the trickster. But one of the most important archetypes Jung identified is the shadow. The shadow represents everything in ourselves that we reject, deny, or repress. It is the part of the psyche that contains the traits we do not want to associate with our identity. To understand how the shadow forms, we have to look at early psychological development. As children, we begin life with a wide range of impulses, emotions, and instincts. A child may feel anger. A child may feel selfishness. A child may feel curiosity, aggression, excitement, or even cruelty. But as the child grows and interacts with parents, teachers, and society, the child begins to receive feedback about which behaviors are acceptable. Some behaviors are praised, others are punished or discouraged. For example, a child who expresses anger might be told they are being bad. A child who acts selfishly might be shamed. A child who behaves in strange or unconventional ways might be rejected by others. Over time, the child learns an important psychological lesson. Some parts of the personality are acceptable, and other parts are not. The parts that are considered unacceptable do not disappear. Instead, they are pushed out of conscious awareness. They are buried in the unconscious mind. This buried psychological material becomes the shadow. The shadow therefore contains everything that our conscious identity refuses to acknowledge aggression, envy, greed, selfishness, cruel impulses. But the shadow does not only contain negative traits. This is a very important point in Jung's theory. The shadow can also contain positive qualities that were suppressed during development. For example, a person who was taught to always be polite and quiet might suppress their assertiveness. A person raised in a strict environment might suppress creativity or individuality. In these cases, even positive energies can become part of the shadow. This means the shadow is not simply evil. It is simply the unknown or rejected part of the self. Jung believed that when the shadow is ignored or denied, it begins to influence behavior indirectly. One of the most common ways the shadow manifests is through psychological projection. Projection occurs when we attribute our own unconscious traits to other people. Instead of recognizing these traits in ourselves, we unconsciously see them in others. For example, a person who secretly struggles with jealousy might constantly accuse others of being jealous. A person who denies their own aggression might perceive others as hostile or threatening. In this way, the shadow is projected outward, and this projection can create conflict. Jung believed that projection does not only happen between individuals, it can also happen between groups and societies. Entire communities can project their shadow onto other groups. This can lead to prejudice, scapegoating, and even war. When societies fail to recognize their own shadow, they often create enemies onto which they project everything they fear or reject in themselves. Another important place where the shadow appears is in dreams. Jung believed dreams were one of the primary ways the unconscious communicates with the conscious mind. In dreams, the shadow often appears as symbolic characters: a dark stranger, a threatening figure, a criminal, a monster, or sometimes a figure that resembles the dreamer but behaves differently. These dream figures represent aspects of the shadow attempting to enter conscious awareness. They are psychological messages from the unconscious. Jung believed that paying attention to these symbols can help individuals understand hidden aspects of their personality. However, Jung did not believe the goal of psychological development was to destroy the shadow. In fact, he believed the opposite. The goal of psychological growth is to integrate the shadow. This process is called shadow integration. Shadow integration means becoming aware of the hidden parts of one's personality, recognizing them without denial, understanding where they come from, and accepting them as part of the total self. Jung believed this process was essential for what he called individuation. Individuation is the psychological process of becoming a complete and integrated individual. It is the process of bringing the unconscious into awareness. During individuation, a person gradually becomes aware of the different archetypal forces within their psyche. They confront the shadow. They encounter deeper archetypes such as the anima and animus, and eventually they move toward what Jung called the self. The self represents the totality of the psyche. It is the fully integrated personality where conscious and unconscious elements are balanced. But individuation cannot occur if the shadow remains completely unconscious, because the shadow will continue to influence behavior from behind the scenes. Jung expressed this idea in one of his most famous statements: "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." What Jung meant by this is that many of the patterns in our lives are driven by unconscious forces. People often repeat the same mistakes, enter the same kinds of relationships, react to situations in ways they do not fully understand. These patterns may actually be driven by unconscious shadow material. Only when these unconscious elements become conscious can individuals gain real psychological freedom. But Jung also warned that confronting the shadow can be uncomfortable because it requires honesty. It requires acknowledging traits that the ego might prefer to ignore. It may involve recognizing anger, selfishness, fear, or destructive impulses. However, Jung believed that acknowledging these elements does not make a person worse. In fact, it makes them more self-aware and psychologically mature. A person who denies their shadow may appear moral or virtuous on the surface, but their denied impulses may emerge in destructive ways. A person who recognizes their shadow becomes more balanced because they understand the full range of human nature within themselves. For Jung, psychological maturity did not mean becoming purely good. It meant becoming conscious. It meant recognizing both the light and the darkness within the psyche. Only then can a person develop true self-knowledge. And according to Jung, self-knowledge is the foundation of wisdom, because when we understand the hidden forces within our own minds, we become less controlled by them. The shadow stops being an invisible force. Instead, it becomes a part of the self that we can understand, integrate, and transform. And in this way, the confrontation with the shadow becomes not a descent into darkness, but a journey towards psychological wholeness.